My name is Basharat Isa, and I'm a lecturer in the Comparative Humanities here at Habib University. Thank you so much, Dr. Shanila, for an enlightening and enriching talk. So basically, Dr. Shama and I, we would have a few questions to Dr. Shanila, and then we'll open the floor for questions. Dr. Shanila, I would like to talk more on the ordinary ethics that I think, at least in my understanding, stands out in your work. And here I would also like to bring in Sabah Mahmood as well, because I have to finish your book yet, but I kind of find some resemblance in both the works as well. So Sabah Mahmood also argues that there is more focus on the doctrinal and legal arguments than the pedagogical or the practices of the religious practices and obligations. So how do you see or how your work in this regard? As I understand, it is more focusing on the practice. It's more focusing on the practices. So could you please elaborate more, basing the ordinary ethics?
Thank you. Thank you to both Professor Isa and Professor Dosa for making time to engage with my work, but also serve as discussants. So my route, and I'm really grateful that you have connected the work to Professor Sabah Mahmood, of course. That's an honor. So I think, yes, precisely as we think about ethics, and my route to ethics was through anthropology, as opposed to the sort of core Islamic studies textual engagement with ethics and the juridical dimension that Professor John and Professor Naqvi mentioned. And so I think from that lens, focusing on ordinary ethics, the work that women do in their daily life, because as I mentioned, I'm actually engaging with women who largely have not written anything. Some women actually don't even, like my nani, doesn't even know how to write her name, right? And so we're thinking about women who've not produced works on ethics in the sort of normative sense. And so focusing on these everyday ethics at the dimension of that intersubjectivity in community. That was my route because my interlocutors in some ways guided me toward that. But as I was thinking about and looking at their work, in addition to simply documenting what they are doing, I was also very inspired to understand how ethics are creating something, they're reproducing something. And particularly in the context of displacement, the work that these women were doing was the important work of regenerating a spiritualized sociality. The sociality, and I use the word reproduce in some ways, but they're not reproducing the same thing as was present in Dhaka or in Nairobi or in Kampala, but a uniquely new sort of social arrangement that emerges and becomes possible on the East Coast of America, for example, right? And so I think that was the other dimension that has allowed me to look at the social arrangements that are being produced, and also how hard the work of these ethical life worlds is. And so in the book, for example, I talk about some of the very difficulties that the same women had within community. So some women who had moved from Dhaka experienced bullying in Jamaat Khanas in Karachi as well. There was one woman who told me about her sister having 2 chotis, and then people would pull at their chotis because her hair was so long, and that was an anomaly. And so when we're thinking about the making of lived ethical worlds, this work is also messy, right? We are people who are trying to engage in the lives of others, and it's not always going to reproduce some of these arrangements. There are going to be risks associated with that ethical life world as well. And so one of the sort of key ideas in the book is around how this religious sociality that I am describing, and we can actually take this religious sociality and you can think through other communities as well, that it's a fragile arrangement. The possibility of these relationalities exists alongside threat and risk. And so the work of reproducing these social arrangements is a work that has to be done repeatedly and constantly in a very sort of concrete way. And so then Jamaat becomes an ethical relationship that one actively has to perform and undertake.
Thank you, Dr. Sharma, and then I'll come back in the second round and then we'll have the audience question.
So, Shanila, I never thought I'd see my family story in academia. So thank you so much for doing this. I mean, it is truly a You know, like when we talk about decolonizing knowledge, I think the stories of those who passed and the stories of those who... I know you lost your grandmother, and I also lost my grandmother, so the story was very important for me as I was reading. But my mom could relate to your work, and that was really exciting. I sent it to my aunts, and they could relate to your work. So academia doesn't have to be inaccessible. I think academia has to be very accessible, and the type of work that you're doing is very meaningful. But what I want to talk about is the value of practicing the ethics in the everyday in the context of precarity and violence, because this is something our community is constantly dealing with and continues to deal with. So is this a decolonizing practice? Or is this a practice of resilience? Or is this a practice of survival? Like, how would you categorize the ethics of the everyday? Where does it sit in the story of the community that we have?
So thank you for that, and I'm so grateful that it resonated with you. So I think I would, so this is my third book, as you mentioned, and I think the first two are very much like sort of a sort of traditional work, but in this book you see me and my family and my Jamaat, right? And so I think in that way, one could argue that this is a decolonial move, because a lot of graduate students, for example, whenever I was actually at the AAR last week, and a lot of them struggle to actually write about themselves and to be taken seriously. And not being cast aside as native anthropologists, like, you know. And so I think from that perspective, I'm privileged to be able to do this, and honored and grateful for that. And I hope that other people will do it in that sort of move. But in terms of the women, I think I don't know if I want to name what they are doing as decolonization. I think that in part, we do see there's a survival instinct as well, particularly when we're looking at the making of the community in North America. And we're talking about 1970s, right? So some of my interlocutors, and of course your family would know this too, tell me about being called Paki on the streets and being thrown things at. So these are like newly brown people in Toronto, right? And so you're now, the multicultural discourse in Canada that we now are so used to hadn't emerged at that time. And so they talk about their sort of everyday struggles, and against those everyday struggles and precarity, the other sort of Jamaati people in the community that they might think about was a source of support. And so in part, coming together in that community formation could be read as survival. But one of the things I always also struggled with to describe in this book, and generally, is to be able to talk about how the cohort of Ismailis that I'm talking about has also strived to transcend ethnic boundaries. So like, for example, when one sees a Khoja or an Indic Ismaili group, you can simply dismiss them and say, oh, you guys help each other because you're the same ethnicity. And so in the context of North America, for example, it's very easy because we're like brown people. And so, okay, you're helping each other because you speak Sindhi or you speak Gujarati, and so you're the same sort of ethnicity. But I also wanted to argue that there is a way in which, because of the ethos, I don't know where Professor Naqvi is, but because of that ethos, the spiritually sort of drawn ethos and guidance of the Imam and these understandings of certain terms from the Quran, the Ismailis also try to transcend some of these sort of communal or ethnic borders. And that's what was more interesting to me, to establish that sort of spiritual community that strives to transcend it. But of course, transcending it is like a moment-by-moment work, right? There are lots of divisions within Ismailis too, and it's an ongoing work. And that's why I keep coming back to how ethical life worlds are these fragile formations, and there's a repeated sort of work to be done. Yeah.
I'll just follow up with another question, because you didn't talk about it in your presentation, but in your book you talk about the second generation, which is us, in a way. And you talk about how critical race conversations in COVID started coming up. And there was that whole webinar that people were running on Ismaili TV where they started talking about Black Lives Matter. They talked about critical race and how we also are racist in our own practice. And so there is a critical subjectivity that's coming out in the second generation. And I liked how you talked about the fact that it's because we didn't have to worry about where our next meal was coming from. So it's a different position for the second generation. Can you talk more about that?
Thank you. So I think my interest, so the book was only going to focus on my primary set of interlocutors, but then I decided to interview the second generation. So these are women who are born in America. So these are the daughters generation of my primary interlocutors. They don't have a sense of war. They haven't experienced the kind of poverty or precarity that their parents might have experienced. They've also grown up in a social context where some form of Ismaili council or a Jamaat Khana was also available, as opposed to the Jamaat Khanas that I just showed you, which were in people's houses, for example, right? And so this is a generation that now has to think about how is it going to participate in this spiritual sociality, and the chapter kind of focuses on their approaches and their ways. But one of the ideas was this struggle that this generation has with the anti-blackness practiced, or anti-Bengaliness practiced by their ancestors in East Africa and in East Pakistan. And so they're trying to figure out, how do I make sense of that anti-blackness? And this is a shared anti-blackness within Asians, right? So this is not specific to Ismaili communities. And so as I was thinking about this, I also personally engaged in this conversation, being a second gen, to think about what does it mean to be a colonized population in East Africa, right? And we can think about the specificities of the colonial project in East Africa, how the East African sort of British colonizers wanted to make sure that the colonized were in separate domains, and so Asians and Africans could not go to the same school, they could not be in the same trades, there were penalties if you were found in the same neighborhoods. And so these are structural colonial policies of the British that ensured that the colonized remains distinct and would not come together against the sort of oppressor, right? And so thinking about the colonial situation of their ancestors was one of the ways in which I also wanted to participate in this conversation, because quite frankly, anti-blackness then proceeds from these structural policies, right? And so to be able to actually think about anti-blackness and the role of British colonial capitalism in that project becomes important as we have a conversation with the second generation, which also wants to establish alliances with other minoritized, racially minoritized communities in America, right? And so that's the conversation in that chapter. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Shalila. So I have my second question, and this is based on a phrase that I'm using from your book. And then I can also connect to this personally, especially when we are speaking of the marginalia, or from the groups like women and others who are at the margins and are absent from what's in the mainstream or the center, especially in terms of their cultural, social, and spiritual production. So how much, the memories, the stories and all that's out there, that's not in the form of what we see in a very academic language or in an academic, books or papers that's available, but in terms of people's living experiences. For example, I speak the world's only language isolate, which doesn't have a script. And I personally come from a place which really serves as the world's only, I guess, neo-colony right now, Gilgit-Baltistan, which is part of the dispute of Kashmir, and people living in various kind of limbos. So how much those memories and those stories and all, not in written form or in an academic form, or important, and how much then there is a ethical and spiritual responsibility of us, the academics, in presenting all of this? Because in Islam, in my understanding, an act of having a niyat of as simple as learning or educating yourself out of a conference like this is an ethical or a spiritual act. So what's your comment on that?
So absolutely, because I think that these are the life worlds that are actually not documented, and they don't have that sort of currency in circulation, particularly the oral cultures that you're speaking about, right? And so when we're thinking about even devotion literatures, and so I was really excited to hear about the next online series on poetry, and I think thinking about some of these poetic traditions and the wisdom in those poetic traditions and in the languages which are largely now not spoken perhaps by the second generation. And so how do we kind of retain that? How do we ensure that that wisdom doesn't simply disappear, like your language, for example? So I think there is an ethical obligation, and I think that is the decolonial part of it. Like many more of us should be doing this type of work because the world is so diverse and there's so many different ways of being ethical, living a Muslim life. And I think it's that heterogeneity that actually will help us become stronger, right, in that way.
So I'll ask one last question and then maybe open the floor for questions from the audience. So I think one of the challenges for many students is telling the story. We have the data, you've got these amazing narratives. How do you get to the point of telling the story the way you designed it, the way you put it together? What's your process? So maybe some of the students would be interested in that.
So personally, this was, so I first started with an oral history with my grandmother. And so that was maybe like 8 years ago. And so I think at that point, this was not going to be a book. It was just because, as you mentioned, my grandmother was really old. And so I wanted to be sure that I understood how she fled Dhaka. Because I had heard these fragments from my mom, but I actually didn't know what was it like for them to live in Dhaka, what were the friends they had, how did they flee. As I mentioned, my nanny was already a widow, and she was ultra poor. So they had like a tin-roofed home, right? And so how did they afford the tickets for an airplane? And then I found out, wo paan ke patte leke aaye the, right? You were transporting paan ke patte for somebody, and then they would give you a ticket to come home. So these were the specifics that I really wanted to learn about. And then over time, I just got curious. I then asked, acha, us plane mein aur kaun tha? Yeah, when I then met an auntie who was on the Chittagong steamer, and then I was like, acha, us steamer mein aur kaun tha? And then a lot of them actually were still alive and living close by. And so I think through this sort of snowball sampling, I started to learn about women and their stories. And quite frankly, I'm not going to take too much credit for it because it's quite frankly not really where the credit lies. Their stories are, these are stories of faith in the most hardest of circumstances. There's an entire chapter on Mu'jiza in here, and maybe I should have shared something from there, but these are places where they actually are not simply telling us about and making sense of a traumatic situation in their own life, but also doing the religious formation of the people who are listening to these Mu'jiza stories. And so thinking about some of these stories and the way in which they participate in the reproduction of a particular form of religious sensibility was really important, and I think maybe that might be the sort of angle. So talk about people you're curious about, talk about these life worlds that are not documented, and these are such rich spaces that hopefully you'll have the barakat of, yeah.
We have volunteers around, and can we have a question from there, please?
My name's Aisha. I feel like I really need to get my word in here because you've essentially chronicled my grandmother who came from India and Konkan all the way to Nairobi. And there, the Kokni community made these, not these Jamaat Khanas, but these community centers and did exactly what you've talked about. So thank you for talking about women who would have never made it to formal documentation until now. And my question is, an earlier question that you asked, what was the role of violence? Because we've talked about how women served their deen or dunya, but we haven't talked about the violence or the oppression or the coercive control that men might have put on them through or via religion, for instance. Thanks.
First of all, I've been really interested in your work, Dr. Kujab, because I've used it for my capstone as well. And I've been reading up on your work as well. So something that I'm really interested in knowing is how, like, the tools or the pedagogy that you might have used in making sure that when you were writing about the narratives of the women and their ethical sensibilities, you weren't, like, invoking or falling into this trap of, like, the removed Western feminist gaze, and how, like, was there a distinction in your mind when you were actively doing this or pursuing this, or in what ways, were you removing your framework or making sure that your framework wasn't falling into that trap?
So I will begin by saying these are all very difficult questions. And so I'm not going to offer any responses. I will offer some ways in which I kind of make sense of them. And I think the question of kindness, beauty, ihsan, and so I was just thinking about these terms as I just came, because my interlocutors also use the term kindness, ihsan, and talk about beauty. I think that's an ongoing project. I feel that all of what we are doing right now is sort of concretely, but in a sort of minor way, trying to sort of contribute to that larger project. So I think maybe that's the one way in which I might think about this. My struggle, as I was thinking a little bit about it, was that there are a lot of very solid studies about trauma. Of Asians in North America, of people who fled East Africa. I wanted to talk about some of that trauma, but to the extent, but maybe because I was also an insider, I never explicitly asked about the experience of that sort of violence that triggered their move. But there are some women who actually shared, and there is an interlude which actually lays out some of the very sort of traumatic, violent experiences that women had during the course of fleeing. And I wanted to at least include that in the interlude so that we can understand that some of the community building, the care work that they do in relation to their families, to each other, to their jamaat, it flows beside that trauma that is always present. That sort of threat of trauma, but also the intergenerational trauma, as you pointed out, in terms of your family too, right? And so I think I wanted to also uplift the work that's ongoing and that flows beside that sort of violence and the ways in which violence remains in the lives of these women, right? And so the last question, I don't think that I actively tried to think of how should I move away from Western sort of paradigms. I don't think that I can extricate myself, because much of my education after I left Pakistan was higher education, was there. And so I think one of the things that I have done is to be a little bit mindful of the frameworks that I'm using. And so I'm sure that you've read, one of my very earliest article was about how I received a grant from Columbia to do a human rights camp, and I actually went back to, I'm from Hyderabad, and so I went back to Hyderabad and I did a big human rights camp for girls, and I ended up reproducing some of the very binaries. I was a master's student then, so I seek forgiveness. And I mean, it was like 150 girls. They stayed for the entire camp, and I reproduced the binaries around human rights, about Muslim men, about how to think of a good life. And then the year later, as I was reflecting on it, I caught myself. And so that was my first sort of intervention in trying to be mindful of how I am influenced by certain modes of knowledge and thinking as well. And so I think maybe the only thing I would suggest to you is to understand some of the ways in which we too are located at the nexus of knowledge and power, and to be mindful of that in our own knowledge-making practices as you're doing your work and I'm doing mine. Yeah. Thank you for the question. Thank you for the questions. Thank you.
Your work really highlights that and brings that into focus. So thank you very much for an excellent discussion and a wonderful talk. The next panel, the first panel, is Spiritual Ethics Inside and Outside. Alexander Key and Dr. Sajjad Rizvi also please join us on the stage.
Hello, everybody. It's a great honor to be here. I'm very happy to be talking to you. I'd like to thank Professor Naqvi for inviting me. I mean, I kind of invited myself when I saw quite how exciting the lineup of speakers was, so I thank Professor Naqvi for accommodating me. And I should also note that Habib and its faculty have had a substantial impact on my own research plans. Right? Before I came into contact with Professor Naqvi and his colleagues here, I hadn't thought about working on Arabic in South Asia or Arabic manuscripts in Karachi, and now I find that's what I'm doing here. So I'm grateful to this institution for shifting the focus of my research. That said, what I'm going to talk about today is right back in the stuff that I've been working on for a long time. And I'd like to go to Al-Muhassin ibn Ali Al-Tanukhi, who lives in Basra and in Baghdad in the 900s. So like the 4th Islamic century, the 900s, he's in Baghdad and Basra. He's an Islamic law judge. So his job is as a qadi, he works as a judge, he's trained in Islamic law. It's very hard to tell a story in which this work is decolonizing, not least because you have a white Englishman talking about an Arab judge at the center of the Arabic Islamic Empire. And I'm painfully aware of kind of the intersection of the two imperial histories that brought the book to me as something that I should work on, and then that enabled the subsequent research that I've been doing on it. So it's like this book about this Islamic law judge from the 900s that gets into the hands of an Englishman in the 21st century is a story of two empires. What is he doing in this book, and why am I talking to you about it today, and how can we think about Tanukhi's ethics? Well, first of all, I mean, he's an author of 2 books. The book that I'm not going to be talking about, Faraj Ba'da Shidda, is a book about how belief and reliance upon God is a source of salvation. When Professor Shanila was talking about the mu'jizat as like a genre, like miracle stories in people's lives, that's what his Faraj Ba'da Shidda book is about. And you get a sense that, a belief in justice, a belief in divine justice, a belief in the power of prayer, the inexplicability of prayer. The book I want to talk about, though, is a much more practical book of ethics. If we think about ethics as a way to answer the question, like, what should we do? There are things that we have to do, where we follow the law. There are maybe things that we want to do. We have desires, we have plans, we have hopes, we have dreams. Ethics is this space in which we're asking, but what should we do? Like, what ought we to do? And here, this book, Nishwar al-Muhadara, has got an interesting take, an interesting structural take. It's the translation of the Arabic title Nishwar al-Muhadara literally means it's the chewing of the cud of conversations. Like cows regurgitate from one stomach to another stomach, and they go over and over and over it again so they can eat the grass. That's what he imagines you doing with human conversation, like with human interaction. You kind of chew it over and over, and that's what he's writing about in the book. And it's like it's an ethical manual on how we should live our lives that answers questions. For me, it would be questions about how, what's the cost and benefit of getting involved in an administrative leadership role at my university? Like, how much, what is it going to cost me if I get involved in politics with my colleagues vis-a-vis just sitting and focusing on my own research and reading books? Or in his case, he's a reasonably wealthy male member of the lower ranks of the elite in Baghdad and Basra in the 900s. And the question for people like him is, should I get involved in politics with the caliph and the court? Is this an arena that is worth me getting involved in, or that I can kind of maintain morality if I get involved in politics? What are the risks and what are the rewards? Should I be trying to get rich? Should I be trying to make real money when I see people making real money out there in the world? And what will it cost me to try and make real money, kind of life-changing money? So the question then is, what should I be reading when I try and make these decisions, these ethical decisions, these what should I do decisions about my life? Now, what ethics, what wisdom, and how do I get the wisdom? How do I kind of process the wisdom? So what I'm going to do now is sort of take you through the opening series of anecdotes in the book and show you how, as an author, Tanukhi helps you think through this kind of ethical question. So he starts off, the book opens up, with a story about people saying that the stories of generosity associated with this particular powerful family, the Barmakids, a big establishment family that spanned 2 generations, made huge amounts of money, very closely connected with the center of power. And he's writing sort of 50 years later. And people are saying, the opening anecdote is, are those stories that people tell about how generous this family was, are they true or are they apocryphal? The next story is somebody's like, well, you're asking these questions about whether the stories are true, but your question about whether the stories are true, you've actually copied it from somebody else who'd already asked whether the stories were true. And then the person you copied the question from, was themselves also asking, okay, if we're telling these stories about this big, rich, powerful establishment family 50 years ago, why aren't we telling stories about how generous the people in power at the moment are? Like, why aren't we talking about the current politicians and their generosity? So there are kind of no answers there in the first couple of pages. All you get is a sense that this is a book that's going to engage questions of fictionality. Like, is this a fiction? Are stories about people true? Could we prove them? Questions of sort of time and history. Like, do we forget stuff when it's in the past? Or do we have a certain attitude to the past that we then sort of hypocritically don't have about the present? Are we more sort of, the glory days versus the current carnage? Questions about originality, who's telling the story, who made up the story, who copied the story from someone else. The next story, and these just come straight after one another. So it's just, hadathana, akhbarana. There's sort of the standard, somebody told me, somebody told me, somebody told me. The next story is about Ibn Zayyad, who's another famous politician from 50 years ago, who's being tortured to get his money at the end of his career, and he's been jammed into a chest as part of the torture in order to get the money from him. And the people who are jamming him into the chest are saying, you should have been nicer. Like, you should have been more generous to people when you were in power. And now you're on the receiving end, and you've got your comeuppance. And he's like, well, if you remember that big, powerful establishment family, the Barmakids, they were famously generous, but, they ended up dead as well. Like, they fell out of political power, they lost their power, they lost their money. So what good did the generosity do them? And then somebody says, just the fact that you're in this box being tortured and you're talking about them, that's it. That's good enough. Like, yeah, they lost all their money, but they made it into history. And you're here and suffering in the present time, and you're talking about them. That's meaning and value enough. Then there's a line of poetry about how people tend to be generous when times are easy, but then when times are hard, they tend to be a bit less generous. And then there's a story about how in the current time, when things are tough, when there's political turmoil, people are increasingly envious of other people's wealth. And somebody's saying that, look, in the old days, when people saw rich people, they would try and emulate them. They'd try and be rich like them. They'd be like, oh, this is a great, example for me to try and get rich myself. But nowadays, when people see rich people, they just disparage the wealth. They're just like, it's ill-gotten, they don't deserve it. So what that little cluster does is it's asking the ethical question, what does it mean to be generous? Generosity is a standard part of ethics. It's good to be generous. It's there in all the manuals. It's known to be a good thing. There are plenty of hadith about it. Tanukhi's an Islamic law judge. He knows that this is a good thing to be generous. But with these stories, he's just kind of poking at it a bit. It's not quite as easy as, we should all be generous. It's more like, well, if we're generous, are we just doing it so people remember us? Is it actually going to help us at all? Are people more generous in the past, less generous today? It doesn't give you any easy answers to the question. Keeping on, I'm going to roll through four or five more of these little stories. And they're all a page or so long in the book. In the next story, there's a very rich politician who likes to make sure that his servants are all well fed. And he notices that at the door of his house, there are, there are sort of the bean husks. Like when you've been eating beans and you throw the husks on the floor. And he's like, why? Why are there bean husks here when I'm giving my doorman meat? And the answer comes, well, the doormen are saving the meat, taking it home for their families, eating beans while they're at work. And he's like, this is disgraceful. I'm a generous man, So he's like, I'm going to make sure that they have meat to take home to their families. And then they'll stop throwing the bean husks on my doorstep and making me look bad. A day goes past, and then he sees the bean husks again. And he's like, what's going on? And they're like, so they're taking the meat home for themselves and their families, but then they don't work 7 days a week, so they're saving the meat until the next day, and so they're eating the bean husks when they come into work, and then they have 2 days of meat for themselves and their families when they go home, and he's outraged. And he's like, okay, and then he gives them a third extra ration of meat so they can eat at work as well as at home. And the very last bit of the story is makes a little remark about how much money it costs him. Wait, is he spending too much? And because we've had those previous stories, remember, where people were asking, is generosity a performance? Is generosity just a way to get credit? Is generosity just a way to get respect? You start wondering, is the rich and powerful person who's giving the meat to his servants actually helping them? Or is he helping himself? Is it a performance of piety and generosity? Or is it real generosity? And Tanukhi doesn't tell you. The next story is about another politician. These stories are, especially at the beginning, they're all about rich politicians. And so this is a politician, a wazir, who builds in his offices a personal toilet, personal bathroom. And then every time he goes to the bathroom, it's fake. He never uses it as a bathroom, but he'll go there and he'll put the money that he's got from the taxes or from extracting from people, and he puts it into the toilet. And then he does this, every day, every time. He just keeps going, putting the money in. And then when the toilet is absolutely full of money, he seals it up, tells, the people around him, the bathroom is done, it's filthy, seal it up. I need to build a new one. And seals it up and builds a new one. What this gives him is a secret bank. Nobody knows where it is. He's hidden the money and kept it safe. What it gives us from the story, right, is a direct equation between money and excrement, right? That's it. So then we're like, wait, is Tanukhi telling us that, money is shit? Is that what's going on here? The author, he doesn't tell us, right? He just tells the story of the toilet and the secret money. He doesn't make the metaphor explicit, but the metaphor is kind of hanging there. And remember, it's like the overall question is, what does it mean to be generous? Should we be generous or not? The next story is about and it's interesting, in the next story, the Tanukhi focuses on how truthful and accurate the historical transmission is. He's like, look, I got this very accurate information from a very trustworthy source who got it from a very trustworthy source. And what is the information that he's got in this very tight historical chain? It's that one particular rich person had 6 million dinars of liquid capital, excluding their property. So they had their capital tied up in their property, and then they had an additional 6 million dinars of liquid capital. Full stop. No comment, no authorial comment at all. Just, that's how much. Next story is one of the politicians has just had a great deal of their money taken by the state. They had a reversal of political fortunes, they were taxed, the caliph came and took a load of their money. The Ibn al-Jassas is unhappy about this, and he's talking to one of his colleagues. And his colleague just goes through how much money he still has left, and then says, look how much money that person has, and how much money that famous person has, and how much money that famous person has. Maybe you're not doing so bad. And Ibn al-Jassas is like, maybe I'm not doing so bad. Maybe I am still quite rich. So remember, if we started off thinking, what is generosity? What does it mean ethically to be generous? And now we're asking, what is wealth? What is wealth? The thing that, what is money? The thing that we're meant to be being generous with. And the book doesn't give us any answers. It just keeps twisting different ideas. Then the next one starts off with a series of stories about Ibn al-Jassas, and these are the kind of funny stories that you tell about rich and powerful people from sort of 50 years ago that make them seem big, but are also kind of poking fun at them. So there's he saw a copy of the Quran that was so old, he said it must be from the time of Anushirvan. Just can't have that, right? And the question is, well, are these stories true? Are these true, these kind of funny stories that poke fun at this minister, or are they lies? Going back to that same question at the very beginning, can we trust the narration or not? Can we trust the historians or not? And then the next story that we get immediately after that is this story of this kind of critical moment in the career of the famous politician of Ibn al-Jassas, in which he's under tremendous political pressure. So he's a big member of the court, he has a lot of money, a lot of power, but he's sort of losing the court politics. His enemies are closing in. The caliph is like putting pressure on him, saying bad things about him in public. He's starting to feel increasingly like his position is untenable. Like he can't kind of politically survive. He's going to lose his money. And he compares himself to a cornered cat. And he's like, and he goes and visits the caliph at night, and he says, look, you know what a cat is like when it goes into a shopkeeper's shop, and then the shopkeeper corners it in a corner and is trying to strangle it, and the cat just kind of leaps up and starts clawing at him in this desperate attempt to save its own life, and it's like ripping the guy's shirt, and it's attacking you, and the cat is going crazy. And he's like, on the one hand, there's nothing weaker than a cat, but on the other hand, there's nothing stronger than a cat that fears for its own life, and I'm like a cat. And this is it's like so frightening and liminal that this is a man like basically saying, I'm prepared to go to the absolute limit to protect my career. That the caliph is sort of like, oh, okay, you know, okay. And he gives him here, he gets the threat, and he gives the guy the respect and the money, the jah that he was looking for, that he thinks he lost. So the narrative arc just in that little story, if you remember that what came before it was the jokey stories about the past, the narrative arc is like, what is the right way to think about political people? Like, do we want to tell jokes about the famous and the rich? Because otherwise we would have to confront quite how nasty they are, like quite how much violence was involved, like the level of sort of threat and risk that it took to accumulate this kind of fortune. Is that what we need to think about? Or can we just sort of tell jokes and be like, oh, you know, he thought a Quran was from, you know, the pre-Islamic times. So the question is, how should we write about these questions? And there were 8 volumes of this book, and we have 3 of them left from the 900s. And absolutely nowhere in any of it does the author give you any of the ethical answers. It's just this series of detailed, amusing, non-amusing, frightening, metaphorical, scatological anecdotes. But the way they all fit into one another, it's asking these ethical questions. It's giving the people who read it tools to think about ethical questions in their own lives. It's notable that this is not functioning in a way unlike the modern novel. So if you think of the way, you know, novels exist in the 21st century, it's ways for us to imagine ethical questions. And I'm put in mind of actually one of my colleagues here at Habib, Saidur Rahman, gave me a copy of his new book, Narrating Pakistan, just when I was outside. And it's the same, like, spin the empty bottle, microfictions, bulletproof bus, like a series of short stories. I mean, I would be tempted to say that it's in this kind of narrative that doesn't necessarily label itself as ethics that people have across time in all kinds of different contexts really been able to find answers and ways to think about the ethical questions in their lives. In like the practical ethical questions that you face, there's some level where it's not that helpful if you turn to, or it's not a complete answer if you turn to a quote-unquote book of ethics. Because a book of ethics, you know, and I wrote my PhD on Raghib al-Isfahani. He's got a book, Makarim al-Sharia, which is a book of ethics that's very much in the kind of Aristotelian tradition that Ahab was talking about and that Professor Naqvi talked about as well. But it's a book that kind of just tells you what to do. It's like, this is good, let me prove it with, you know, a hadith, with a bit of exegesis. Let me tell you that Aristotle says this is the correct way to behave. Let me tell you that the Quran says this is the correct way to behave. There's some level where I think across history, when faced with ethical problems, what we keep doing, whether it's today writing novels in the 21st century, or whether it's Muhsin bin Ali Al-Tanukhi writing this series of anecdotes, we need these stories that don't give us the answers, that just keep pushing us to think about the difficult questions. And they give us other people who face the same problems or parallel problems, and they ask us, should we follow their example or not? Do we want to behave like the rich people in Baghdad? Because they were generous and that was good. Do we not want to behave with them like them? Because look at the terrible stuff they had to do to get their money. Do we want to compare the past? Do we want to compare the present? And novels and books like Tanukhi, they don't give you the answers. They just leave you with more ethical questions. Thank you.
I'm the person keeping you from your shisha or your biryani or whatever it is to come. And I'm kind of minded in these contexts as well that, what we academics do is we play with words. We kind of like find something, oh, that's cool. I'll take that and I'll transpose it and put it here. And a lot of the words which I'd want to say have actually been mentioned already. So I'm not going to bother at all with an introduction. Almost every important saying has already been mentioned by Norman. Najib's also mentioned various things. I was going to have this kind of elaborate decolonial introduction on whether moral agency is even possible today. But let's just skip that and put that aside, and let's look at one particular sort of reparative model that I want to put forward. Because also reparative is something we've talked about a lot as well. And I describe this reparative model as a universal model as opposed to a universalist model. And let me just kind of quickly say why I'm making that distinction. I think what's interesting about saying something is universal is you're opening up the possibility that it proffers a particular path which you may be able to find in lots of different contexts. Whereas a universalist or universalizing model is something which assumes that we've perfected it, this is like the way it should be and everyone should adopt it, right? So I'm going to be talking about something which is very familiar, which a lot of you know about, and it's called velayat. It is a Shi'i concept, but it's also a widely accepted context in lots of Sunni contexts. And it's actually the idea of velayat as love and devotion and intimacy, and the term I use is divine friendship, is something which is found in lots of different traditions. And what I'm basically going to contend is that divine friendship is the ground for a possibility of moral agency. And actually, in an Islamic context, I don't really understand how you can possibly even have moral agency if it's not grounded in velayat. So, what I want to do is very briefly take you through some kind of textual discussions of it. as I said, I'm going to skip the takhalluq bi akhlaq is la. I could have just talked about that. That would have been a wonderful start and end, because that brings the ethical, it brings the spiritual together, and also brings the sort of the reparative. There's an issue, you have to deal with it, and the fact that it's an imperative, takhalluq is an imperative. You must do this. It gives you an indication that it's an act. It's something which has to be done. It's not just an idea that you need to kind of think through. And it's something which has to be about what your embodiment and what your particular context is as well. Ultimately, moral agency cannot exist in a vacuum. So even the notion of walayat and the moral psychology of it in an abstract sense is merely a ground. There has to be something which builds upon it. And there's another thing which I was going to say, but I don't want to repeat what I said in the last kind of online. I don't know if anyone watched it. When we did the online one last time, I talked about messianism. Messianism for me is very much the culmination of that process, but I won't repeat it because each of these has to be seen as a certain kind of performance art. And it's also kind of like, Rumi's, when he famously says about his verse, my verse is like Egyptian bread. Once it's stale, it's stale. So, go back and look at that, but, we've moved on. So I won't repeat what I have to say about mysticism, but messianism, but think about that in the background as kind of a culmination of what I'm talking about. So, mindful of time, and I really will be brief because I don't think there's a necessity for a 30-minute or 25-minute lecture, so to speak. I was originally, of course, going to talk about some of the foundations of what walayat is in sort of fundamental Shi'i texts of the early period, like Al-Kafi, which of course has a famous section, the Kitab al-Hujjah has extensive discussions on walayat. But let me just say one thing about what sort of relationship walayat is. And it's a relationship of 4 kind of levels or 4 facets. So one thing we often forget is that walayat as divine friendship, of course, starts with God. God is the wali. God is the ultimate wali. And the way in which he expresses his divine friendship, he possesses it, has to then be the basis of these different levels and facets. The second one, of course, is the prophet and the imam who expresses it, because they are the intimates of the divine, and because they are the face of the divine to the cosmos. And so there's something that they have, and it's something that they express. And the third element, or the third facet of the divine friendship, is what others then owe those friends of God, and what others owe to God herself. Right? So walayat is something which is owed. It's that devotion, it's that love. It's that simple thing you see. You go to a shrine, for example, as we did a shrine crawl yesterday. We'll do another one, inshallah, later. And the fundamental thing is the simple acts of love and devotion. I'm not talking about the kind of formal, the chadar and the thing. In a sense, that's kind of, for me, that is marginal, that's peripheral. It's a simple love. It's a simple, you see someone there with their eyes closed, or they're touching the grave, or they're simply sitting in the corner, lost to themselves. And of course, lost to themselves is the ultimate attachment, actually, to reality. It's those sorts of, those things which show you that love and devotion. And the final thing, which is really important, is to remember again that divine friendship is socialized, exists in the context. So divine friendship is also what then you owe to your fellow person. It's not just what you owe to God. It's not just what you owe to the friends of God. It's also what you owe to each other. And if you do not act in the way in terms of what you owe to each other, it's as if you haven't expressed that friendship and that intimacy and that love to God and the friends of God. So that's kind of the structure. Now, one interesting way of looking at coming back to shrines in a different way, one of the interesting ways to look at how Vilayat then works out, before I get to some of the more kind of worked out moral theory of moral agency, is to look at the actual practice of pilgrimage. And we find this from the earliest period. So one of the foundational kind of Shi'i texts from the 10th century is Kamil al-Ziyarat of Ibn Qulaway, which is the earliest kind of work which tells you why pilgrimage is important, who you should visit, what you should do, how you should prepare for it, how you should address the friends of God, and so forth. It's kind of a total work. And it's like one of those classic things where, I mean, talking about decolonizing the study of Islam, one of the real problems about the study of Shia Islam has been, well, everything kind of happens in the Safavid period. They kind of make up all this stuff, right? They kind of make up this whole idea that pilgrimage is really important. Pilgrimage is there right at the beginning. It's like, you can go back all the way to the sorts of things that the Prophet is saying about how you should sit with the pious, how you should remember those who have passed, and so forth. And the simple kind of acts of, when people talk, certainly within Shia communities, there's a sense that people have always visited Karbala, going back to the earliest period. The fact that there's a memory of destruction of the shrine under Mutawakkil, which is earlier than Ibn Qulaway and all these texts, shows you that there is a sense in which people used to go there. It has a significance. Now, Kamil al-Ziyarat discusses lots of these sorts of things, and it discusses things like the etiquette of pilgrimage as a communal thing. So the simple acts of sharing, the simple act of sharing food, of generosity, of how you behave, how you prepare for yourself, what you should take, what sort of friends you should take. We coming back to the question of choosing your friends, what sort of friends you should take, because that's going to have an impact. And again, we see this all the time in the way in which we then conceive of pilgrimage in the world today. I think in many cases, the best way for us to convey what religion is, what spirituality is, and what ethics is, actually is just to kind of either take people along, which is the best thing, or at least take a camera and just film what's going on. What is going on simply at a particular shrine where people are really attaching themselves to a particular friend of God. See how they're, sharing simple things. I remember the first time I ever went to the shrine of Ibn Arabi in Damascus. There was an old faqir in both senses of the word, both someone who was a Sufi, but also, just a poor old guy. And I was coming out to the shrine, and he smiled at me, and he gave me a couple of sweets, the sort of sweets that you give kids. It's a simple thing. He felt an obligation to share. He had 3 sweets with him, and he gave me 2. And it's those sort of, talking of ordinary ethics, that's what you find everywhere. The fact that, nowadays, millions of people go to Karbala on important dates like Arba'in, and the simple fact is people in those towns and places around will literally empty their houses and invite you in so that you can spend the night. People who don't have very much will save up what little they have so that they can run a little stall and feed and give people drink, during that thing. It's what they do as an act of devotion which connects them, to divine friendship, and also connects them, to each other, because there's a recognition that everyone is on that same path. In some ways, the kind of the walk, the Najaf to Karbala walk, which we see every year, is in many ways a wonderful symbol for life. It's a particular journey. It's a journey in some ways from one beloved to another, and it's a journey in which everyone is on the same path for the same sorts of reasons and sharing along, and also dealing with each other's difficulties, whether it's blisters, simple things. People sometimes also unfortunately have heart attacks. There's medical kind of aid and stuff. People massaging your feet because it is tiring and so forth. But in a sense, any kind of movement like that, pilgrimage, which happens in so many different traditions, encapsulates what the journey of life is. The other example, of course, is Hajj, and there's ways in which we can talk about Hajj as well. And one of the the links between the early texts on pilgrimage and ethics as such, Ihab mentioned the text by Naraqi Jami' Sa'ada, that from the 18th century, the Compendium of Felicities. And one of the interesting things is that work is in some ways a kind of a classic of the Aristotelian tradition, saying, well, ethics is all about understanding the ontology of the moral soul and so forth. It actually ends with a chapter on pilgrimage. It ends on a chapter on pilgrimage to Medina and to the shrine cities in Iraq. And it has this interesting thing where it says that, although the souls of the friends of God have departed their bodies, their purity and their power means that they retain a presence and an influence in this world. And in that way, they draw pilgrims to themselves, and they are aware of their pilgrims, and the term he uses, they emanate their light onto them to purify them. And they emanate their light to purify them and to give them a contentment and pleasure, as well as comfort. I think this is an important point. The question of comfort, the giving of mutual comfort as a fundamental thing about what we do to be human is really important. Again, last year I talked about grief and why grief is important and why grief is, for example, central to the Shi'i tradition. But grief is central to the Shi'i tradition because it gives comfort, right? There's a certain way in which we memorialize those of our beloveds who have passed away. And it starts with grief, but it ends with comfort, precisely because the sharing of grief alleviates the pain. It doesn't get rid of the pain, but it alleviates the pain. It is about attaining that comfort which comes beyond that. And so then for him the culmination of ethics lies precisely in this divine friendly act of pilgrimage. Now, I'm going to just discuss one other idea, and in some ways I think, again, in the reparative sense of actually creating or at least recovering an archive of knowledge. So one of the things which is often said about the study of the Islamic intellectual traditions is that formal ethics, or certainly ethics, is rather absent. It's often said that the great philosophers in the Islamic traditions don't really talk about ethics. Now, the interesting thing is that while they might not have necessarily major treatises on ethics, or they might not necessarily have sections on ethics in their sort of summa, which talk about metaphysics and so forth. One of the best ways of finding discussions of ethics is actually in commentaries, not in exegesis. And given the way in which the idea of ethics often is located within the ontology of the rational soul, one of the best places to find this is in the 17th century Safavid thinker Mulla Sadra's commentary on Al-Kafi, and in particular on the book on the intellect, the Kitab al-Aql. Now the Kitab al-Aql, of course, discusses the way in which the intellect is a particular kind of faculty. It's an important moral faculty, as Ihab mentioned in the famous hadith of Imam Sadiq alayhi salam. But a number of the sayings in that book are then taken as the basis for establishing a much more worked out notion of ethics and the sorts of virtues and vices which work within that system, and how it is that one should go about making the virtues overpower the vices. How do you deal with the complementarities? And this is the famous 14th hadith in that particular, in the ordering of the chapter. It's an extremely famous hadith on which there are a number of people have written separate commentaries. It's known as the hadith of the forces of intellect versus the forces of ignorance, the forces, the junud al-aql wa junud al-jahl. And there's 75 of those, and there's 75 pairings. And these are pairings of virtues and vices. And what Sadra wants to do is that he wants to show that, so what's going on in this is that as there is kind of a broader struggle in the world, a conflict between different kinds of values and so forth, that struggle also plays out within the self. And that struggle plays out within the self, so to kind of win through that struggle, to be on a particular path, one has to make sure that the virtues kind of overpower the vices. And yet what's really interesting about it is that in some ways, the vices in and of themselves are not real. They are absences, they are shortcomings, they are failures, they are imperfections. And so there's in that sense it's an understanding that we're not necessarily talking about straightforward oppositions. We're talking about a certain spectrum of perfection and imperfection. And so in that process of understanding the difference between turpitude and rectitude, one needs to understand it as a particular kind of spectrum. And in that, there are certain pairings which I thought were interesting and useful to bring up here. So one is, for example, I was thinking of your class. One thing is this contrast between hilm and safa, right? So hilm, the idea of kind of kindness, of particular discernment, and safa as kind of stupidity. A particular kind of unknowing but silly and almost wanton stupidity. And the reason why they are juxtaposed is partly because of this notion of equilibrium or balance. A stupid person has no balance. A stupid person is unhinged in this idea, in this kind of concept. Because they are, for example, quick to get angry. They become accustomed to ignorance, so they always choose the wrong choice which is put before them. Whereas kindness or hilm in this context is about being perfectly aligned and perfectly balanced, so that they can discern how to act in that particular way, so that when they have choices which are put before them, they choose the right choice. And the comparison Mulla Sadra gives here for hilm is husn al-khulq. So here he means both the sort of the beauty of character. So it's about beauty of character, your character, which is then expressed in a particular way. But it's also the idea of beauty of character in recognition of others. So it's like, we think of, when we talk about things like husn zan, it's like thinking well of someone. So the beauty of your character is also reflected in thinking well of others. Another mutual pairing, which again is very important socially, is the difference between attachment and cutting off ties. So because divine friendship requires mutuality of between people, requires ties of compassion and mercy, the opposite of cutting ties off if you cut your ties off, you're by definition turning your back on intimacy and friendship. And, by definition, by withdrawing yourself from that, you are expressing an imperfection and a shortcoming. Now, I just wanted to mention two very quick examples, because going through 75 pairings is going to take a while. And it's actually about 150 pages of text, but, there you go. Just being aware, I think in some ways just being aware of what there is out there in terms of that kind of act of recovery to overcome epistemicide, right? So Noor and others written wonderfully on epistemicide. One of the aspects of epistemicide is the fact that what has been taken away or displaced or destroyed, in a sense, also means that people themselves who come from a particular intellectual, cultural, spiritual tradition then are deracinated from that. They're not aware of it. And I think in some ways what is precisely problematic is when you have intellectual resources such as the Kitab al-Aql and these sort of commentaries, people just not being aware that this is something they can go to. Of course, they can go to the shrine and they see things in real time, in reality, and that's important. But, academics require some sort of theoretical foregrounding of that. We like to come up with reasons for why this is the case. And those texts do, in many ways, provide those important reasons. Last sentence, because I should finish, right? Yeah. So coming back to this. Okay. So divine friendship as a foundation for moral agency is precisely the sorts of things which I have been talking about. And the joy and the pleasure of it, the consociality, the comportment of it is as important as the sharing of the grief of loss and the pain of patience. And patience is an important element here because it then links us to messianism. And it's in some ways one of the most difficult virtues to come up to really deal with. Because grief, loss, oppression is really difficult to just express some sort of contentment and patience with. Even being told that be patient and there will be respite in the future, be patient, you will get your reward in the afterlife. It's a very difficult thing to say when you've got, when you see what you see. It's really difficult to be patient in that way. So, sorry. So this is why, in some ways, there has to be an element of what that divine friendship and messianism can show us as well. It's not, as I said, it's not good enough just to say be good. It's not just good enough to say be patient. That's why stories of the friends of God are important. That's why the presence of the friend of God is important. That's why the comfort of the friends of God are important. Because once you can transform yourself, then only you can have a useful impact upon others. That's only when you can be useful. If moral agency is something that we do for others, then it has to be the case that we can at least repair ourselves before we can get to that. So that's why this notion of divine friendship as the base, the foundation of it has to be important. And as I said, just want to reiterate the final point, the point I made right at the beginning. For me, this is a universal thing. Precisely because of the possibilities. Not because I have kind of come up with a great idea and we've come to the end of history and this is the idea that everyone should embrace, but rather because this is something which anyone who hears it will say, okay, this is familiar to me because this is part of my own particular experience and tradition. This is precisely why Vilayat works in so many contexts. Because when you see it and you appreciate it and experience it, you realize it's something that is found everywhere, and then you see it in those different things, in the kind of the depths of the difficulties of the human condition, but also the kind of the joys of comfort that come out of that. Sorry for going over, but thank you.
So we have little time, and I'm just going to ask a question each. I had many questions written up. Alexander, how rare is someone like Tanukhi in the 900s?
I think that as a person who had the kind of job that he had and the kind of socioeconomic background that he had and the kind of learning and access to knowledge that he had, pretty common, like that plenty of people were like him. Not that many people wrote books like this. And then interestingly, adab works, towards the end of the 900s, but even earlier, Ibn Qutayba, even before Tanukhi, were writing books that were much more structured. And they were still structured without giving you clear answers, like Mahasin Masawi, a good thing about this, a good thing and a bad thing, a good thing, a bad thing about the same topic. A good thing about men, a bad thing about men, a good thing about children, a bad thing about children, but in a much more systematic, chapter-based structure. Tanukhi's Nishwa kind of stands out because of its iterative, free-flowing, but at the same time very carefully constructed form. Very like, the postmodern novel, I would argue.
Right. The postmodern novel was before social media, so we're just going to move quickly so that the audience also has some opportunity.
You talked about Mishri, a long walk from Najaf to Karbala, people giving charities, doing good things. It's very difficult for me to understand how is it just confined in the boundaries of religion, and how is it not possible outside of it?
Of course, outside of religion, you find kind of phenomena which are religion-like. The most obvious example is sport, and you should know. I mean, cricket is the pain and grief and failure and sometimes pleasure of Pakistan, I guess. But I mean, it does come back to this question. I mean, as I said right at the beginning, divine friendship does require a divine. And so, while there can be sort of simple acts of kindness between people, and I would never deny that doesn't happen, the question is, what is the broader framework in which people act? And in many cases, I think there has to be some sort of grounding for that. In some ways, if the question is about, can you have the possibility of moral agency in the absence of a religious structure, then, in some ways a more complicated question, but certainly, I think it would be a question of trying to find what works functionally in different contexts. Certainly for me, I think pilgrimage is a good example of how that works in religious contexts, and that particular one. But I can't off the top of my head think of an exact kind of parallel which might work. I mean, of course, as I said, people do simple acts of kindness for all sorts of reasons. I was recently at a charity dinner which was run by Medical Aid for Palestinians, and the board who run that, do things for all sorts of different reasons. But I think fundamentally for them, it comes back to something which I was kind of trying to get to at the beginning, which is they do think there is a possibility, at least, of moral agency. I don't think any of those people who are doing that work, those doctors and others who on the ground and at the Rafah border or in Gaza or other places, I don't think any of them is doing it and thinking that that act is free of any kind of moral consideration or value.
My question to Sajjad, that there are many shrines in every nook and corner of the subcontinent and in most part of the world. But in one of the book it was shown that there was a shrine in Jannatul Baqi. But 90 years ago all were demolished. And this shows the great difference in that part of the world and another part. There are so many shrines. So how we should see that kind of difference?
So again, I think there's different ways of looking at it. So there are, kind of structures of violence surrounding Baqi and in the Rawza of the Prophet, of course, in Medina. But that doesn't actually mean that things don't happen. I've been in Baqi lots of times, and you come across all sorts of people. And for them, as I said, the presence of the friends of God is clear. There's, absolutely no doubt about that. And, the simple fact that, and people want to know. So I remember once I was there and a couple of Pakistanis, I don't know where they were from in Pakistan, came to me and said, can you tell me where the different shrines are? Because I seem to know where I was going. And also these people are not Shi. They didn't know whether I was Sunni or Shia. They didn't ask. But because I was talking about the graves of the Imams and then some others, the son of the Prophet, etc., they were asking me. And for them, it had a presence. And it had a sense of loss as well. But there's a comfort of being there. I remember the first time I went to Baqi, to be honest, I couldn't stop crying because the sense of grief was so great. But I would not have missed going there. For me, it was important that I went because it was also an act of comfort. Because, as I said, the presence was important. So, of course, many of us would love to be in a position where, Baqi and Medina would be like Najaf and Karbala. Not necessarily in the way it is right now, because I personally am also against the kind of massive aggrandization of the shrines. I understand why it's being done for access, but there's a sense in which it also becomes more difficult, in a sense, to access when it becomes so big. But the absence of structures does not change the fact that it's a sacred space. Does not change the fact that people who then are in Medina and are being harassed by police do not help each other and sort of, cover each other and share stories and share love and share food and so forth.
Thank you for being here. I had one question regarding this example of how you talked about, these different shrines and people come there, they contribute their time and little bit of wealth that they have and they welcome people. But, in my personal observation, most of the times the people that you see in such locations contributing whatever little they have in terms of their, manpower or time or efforts or whatever, or volunteer work, are mostly people who are not very well educated or very wealthy. While you would assume that with wealth and with abundance of knowledge, there would come this sense of sharing with others, but you see that most of the time the people who actually are out there on the ground doing that are neither very wealthy in terms of the knowledge, in terms of the worldly degrees or qualifications, or in terms of the wealth that they have in their bank accounts or whatever. So, what's this weird relationship, in your opinion, with abundance of wealth and knowledge and this lack of empathy? Because as you mentioned in your lecture as well, everything that's going on around the world, it's not like there's not enough people who don't know what's going on or don't have the material possessions to stop it from happening. But the people mourning are those people who don't have much at hand. Why? What's this relationship between having something and just not caring about anything?
I don't think we can deny the possibility of moral agency on from people who have wealth or who have degrees. Simply speaking from self-interest, obviously, comparatively, I am wealthy and comparatively, I am well-educated. And of course, you do see those sorts of people there. But I think there are different kinds of ways in which people understand the pursuit of what they want to do in the world. And I think there are certain kinds of pursuits which harden the heart. There's a kind of classic metaphor of hardening the heart or dulling the heart, rusting the mirror of the heart. And in that context, it becomes more difficult than to see the other as yourself, to see the other as someone who is worthy of help and compassion and love and so forth. And it could be some of those sorts of attachments that lead to that process are ones of attachment of status and power and wealth. Fundamentally, when we talk about decoloniality, the basic problem is coloniality of power. Coloniality of power works through in lots of different ways. So there is that pride in a certain kind of learning. There is a pride in certain kinds of, or privilege in certain kinds of ways of seeing yourself and so forth. And it's precisely that, ultimately coloniality of power is the greatest thing which hardens the heart in some ways. And sort of then being able to reflect upon that and wanting to do something about that then has to be, of course, open to everyone. And that's precisely why, decolonization cannot just be selling another Euro-centered kind of trend to what some people call the Western world. I came across this fairly recently. Western as opposed to Reston. It's actually kind of neat. It actually has to be meaningful. It has to be meaningful globally. It has to be meaningful within our institutions in Euro-America and other places as well. And it has to then affect the way in which politics in the public sphere work. I come from Britain. Britain is a country in which the government happily declares itself to be a hostile environment to people who are not from there. And actually also for quite a lot of people who are there. Now, hostile environment and actually taking pride in the notion of hostile environment is kind of obscene. It's a basic obscenity. And that's something which people have to deal with. It's like it's worse in Holland in some ways. The hostility is even greater. In other parts of Europe, in many ways, it's even greater. But it's a massive kind of issue. So I think, moral agency is important, and it's about recognizing what the obstacles to that are. We can't just allow coloniality to reduce us to kind of our bare bodies, which are there to be either destroyed or venerated, depending on where we are and how we are seen by certain kind of dominant epistemologies. It's got to still be that, yes, we can say something. And, if it, even if it involves what would be considered a political failure, it doesn't matter, because at least you have borne witness. And that's also one of the reasons why I think the Shi'i tradition is important, because political failure is embraced. It's not political failure, it's the success of divine friendship which is important. We don't care about siyasat, we care about walayat.
When I was listening to your question, I was thinking, like that, why do they behave like this? Like, how can I get into the minds of people, and why do they behave like this is exactly what someone like Tanukhi is trying to work out. Like, exactly the way you phrased your question. Why do people with the opportunities do less? And I think that's not, I don't want to locate that narrativizing mode of thinking about these questions through the imagined lives of others. It's not just like Arabs in Baghdad in the 900s, and it's not just modern novels either. Like, people across time and space have always dealt with exactly that kind of question you're asking by imagining other people's lives or other people's choices and writing about it.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum. First, I would like to congratulate to Habib University for organizing this beautiful event over the important issue, the ethical and the spiritual in Islam. And my question to Professor Ahab and Sajjad Saab, that actually what is the real source of ethical guidance, and how can we cultivate compassion and empathy in our daily life?
Yeah, as I said, for me, it's the source is walayat. That's the foundation of it. That's, understanding that kind of multifaceted relationship is precisely that. And Norman also mentioned at the beginning the famous hadith of the Prophet, about the nature of the mission. I mean, the nature of the mission is the perfection of makarim al-akhlaq. So, the source of what constitutes a moral agency, the possibility of ethics, is precisely that. It is precisely that walayat. I think in many ways people have to be aware of it, and people have to be aware of the many resources that we have within the traditions which point you to that, and the simple things that you do see. I mean, I'm not saying every single shrine in the world is a wonderful spiritual sacred space. I mean, at least some of them are simply tamasha. I've been to many shrines in Pakistan which are clearly tamasha, and others which people would probably regard as tamasha, which I think are actually wonderful. The contrast certainly in shrines in Lahore is clear, and even in Karachi, and also the way in which some shrines change. I mean, Abdullah Shah Ghazi is a place which I've known since I was a kid, but I was kind of appalled the last time I went there because of the way in which the space has changed. But that's got to do with Pakistani politics, and I'm not interested in going there.